Today I am bringing you a list of my top 10 books that I have read in the last 5 years since starting my BookTube channel. I am so excited for this video. It's one that I've been planning for a while to celebrate my 5-year anniversary. I've also not really planned this video. Usually I would make quite a few notes so that I don't lose my train of thought while I'm talking, but I thought, you know what, I want this video to be about my enthusiasm for these books. It took me such a long time to narrow down this list because I have read over 500 books in the past 5 years. In order to make things a little easier for myself, I haven't included any books that I talked about in my top 10 fantasy series video that I made last year. I have still included some fantasy books on this list, but I've stuck to standalones. And then I also haven't included any books that I talked about in my top 10 thrillers video. Again, there is a thriller or two on this list, but they're books that I read after I made that video. I basically picked out 2 books per year that I've been on BookTube to try and make things a little more even. So we're going to start in 2020 and end in 2024. I'm not going to include any books that I've read in 2025 because you've heard me talk about them recently, and I'm going to do a top 10 of 2025 at the end of this year anyway. So we are going to get started, and the first book that I wanted to talk about is a book that I haven't been able to stop thinking about since I read it. I don't think I've actually talked about it since I read it in 2020. It's a really difficult book to recommend because of what it's about, but the book that I'm talking about is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. This very much feels like a character study. We're following a woman called Vanessa who is now in, I want to say, her early to mid 30s. However, when she was 15, she was groomed by her English teacher. She doesn't see what she went through as abuse though. She looks back on that time and thinks that they had this great love affair. She sees him as the first love of her life. However, in the present day, another girl has come forward to accuse this same guy of sexual assault. Vanessa is a very complicated character, and I just thought this was so powerfully written. It felt like a very raw exploration of abuse and especially the impact that it has on victims. It's a very dark literary fiction, and there are some truly uncomfortable moments, but that's very intentional. You are meant to feel for this character. It's meant to place you inside her mind, and yeah, she is a very complicated character. Vanessa felt like a real person to me, so even though it is incredibly uncomfortable, I think if this sounds like something that interests you, then yeah, I would recommend it, but like I said, it's a really difficult book to recommend. Moving on to my second book of 2020, and we have The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I actually talked about this book quite recently because I did a whole video where I ranked and reviewed all of Taylor Jenkins Reid books, and this was my favourite. This is one of my favourite books of all time, hence why it's in this video. But if you don't know, this is following Evelyn Hugo, who was a famous movie star back in the 60s and 70s. However, she disappeared from the public eye and no one really knows why until now. She's come forward, she's now in her 70s, and she contacts an unknown journalist because she's finally ready to tell all about her scandalous life. And I loved Evelyn. I thought that she's just so iconic, okay? She's one of the most iconic fictional characters that I've ever read about. I got to the end of the book and I couldn't believe that I hadn't been reading about a real person. She's unapologetically herself, and that means that at times she was selfish, she made mistakes, but it's just so interesting being in her mind because you understand every decision that she made. And I thought this really captured the glamour of old Hollywood without glamorizing it. You know, it talks a lot about how the LGBT community were treated in Hollywood, and yeah, I just thought that everything about this book was fantastic. I read it in like one sitting because I couldn't put it down. We're now moving into 2021, and we have A Man Called Uwe by Frederick Backman. Making this list has made me realise I really love books that are essentially character studies, where you're following a character for a really long time and you're getting to know everything about them and their life, and that is essentially A Man Called Uwe. So Uwe is an older man, I think he's in like his 60s, lives alone, and his neighbours see him as this grumpy old man. He is quite frustrating. He is quite nosy. He's a bit of a, I don't want to say busybody, but he complains a lot and his neighbours are quite wary of him. This is really a book about not judging people based on surface level stuff. It's really easy to look at someone and think, oh, they're just a grumpy old man. But through this book, you get flashbacks to Uwe's past. You see his life, how he met his wife, and you do really get to know him as a character. And this is also a book about mental health. So do be aware of that if you are thinking about reading this. I thought that Uwe was, yeah, just a fantastic character. The plot for this is basically a young family moves in next door and you see his icy facade start to melt, and it's just really wholesome. It's a book about found family, and I just love the way that Frederick Backman sees people. His writing is actually quite simple, but the observations that he makes about humanity, it just really impacts me, and I sobbed my little heart out while reading this. It was very emotional. The second book that I have from 2021 is Act Your Age, Eve Brown by Talia Hibbert. This is technically the third book in a series. It's the third book in the Brown Sisters series, which is a romance series following three sisters. So each book follows a different sister and their romance. Interestingly, I think Dani Brown, which is the second sister, I think she's probably my favourite out of the sisters in terms of the main characters, but in terms of the whole book, I think that Act Your Age, Eve Brown was my favourite. This was just so heartwarming. It was funny. Talia Hibbert, in my opinion, writes the perfect rom-com, and in this particular book we're following Eve Brown, who is a bit of a mess. Her parents are literally about to cut her off because they want her to just get her act together and get a stable job. Eve decides to run away to the countryside where she stumbles upon a B&B where the owner is about to hire a new chef. Eve ends up running him over with her car and she decides that she's going to help because he now can't really run this B&B properly because his arm's in a sling. It kind of plays into the grumpy sunshine trope because Eve is very much sunshine and rainbows and very bubbly and happy, whereas Jacob, the love interest, is a bit more introverted. He's also autistic, and I think you can really see how much Talia Hibbert cares about her characters through the way that they interact and how respectful they are of each other. I also love the way that she writes spicy scenes. The spice in her books, to me, feel like they're a way of showing the connection between the characters. They're not just thrown in for the sake of it. I think you can really feel the connection between the characters when you read a Talia Hibbert book, and so that's why it's one of my favourite romance books of all time. Moving on to 2022, and first up we have Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. This is a cozy fantasy. It was one of the first cozy fantasy books that I read, if not the first. It was very much the book that made cozy fantasy popular, and for good reason. I understand why some people don't love cozy fantasy because it's low stakes and I know that some people prefer there to be stakes in their fantasy stories, but I loved how this was so slice of life. We're following a main character called Viv, who is an orc, and she decides that she doesn't want to be a warrior anymore. She wants to move to a city and set up a coffee shop in this place where they've never heard of coffee, and it's following her setting up this business, all of the issues that arise with that, but how it brings this community together. If you love found family, you need to read this. It's so cute, so wholesome. There's a hint of romance, which I loved. The descriptions of food as well are just fantastic. I really want to reread this. There's actually a new book in this series coming out soon, which I'm very excited for. Next up we have Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. This is one of my favourite sci-fi books of all time. I loved how it blended these intense emotional moments with a bit of a mystery, because the plot for this, if you don't know, we're following a main character called Ryland who wakes up on a spaceship in space and he has no idea how he got there. He's completely alone because his companions have died. So he's very confused because he's not an astronaut. What is he doing on this spaceship? And you do get these flashbacks because gradually his memory starts to come back to him. And yeah, it's one of those we need to save the world type stories, and I loved how accessible this felt. It made me feel really clever because Andy Weir has this way of writing science in a way that makes you feel like you're understanding him. I don't know how accurate it is, but it made me feel clever because I knew that I was following everything. I can't really tell you my favourite thing about this because I feel like it would be a bit of a spoiler, but this has a very wholesome friendship and I loved it. I loved the characters in this. One character in particular made me feel very emotional, and you know, if a book makes me feel emotional, it's getting 5 stars and it's probably going to become one of my favourites of all time. 2023 was such a great reading year. I really struggled to narrow it down to just 2 books for this year, but one of the books that I went with is The Travelling Cat Chronicles by Hiro Arakawa. If you love cats and you haven't read this yet, I would strongly recommend it because you get the perspective of a cat, and the cat sounds exactly how you would imagine a cat would sound if you were inside its brain. Very sassy and sarcastic and so funny. This book, I mean, it broke me. I have not cried so hard at a book ever, I don't think. It put me through so many emotions because in this we are following a guy who, he has a cat, however he can no longer look after his cat, so you're following them on this road trip around Japan where he's visiting family and friends, trying to find someone who can look after his cat. It's not just about the cat, it's really about this guy and his life and the tragedy that he's been through. It's a very gentle story and it affected me so deeply for a variety of reasons which I'm not going to go into, but I thought this was beautifully written. I know that this author has a new book that's just come out, or it's just been translated into English. Would really like to check that out at some point. And there's also a short story collection that has 2 short stories following characters from this book. If you have read this book and you didn't know that, then there's a short story collection called The Goodbye Cat that I would also recommend. Next up we have The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wong, which is one of my favourite standalone fantasy books. M.L. Wong is becoming one of my favourite fantasy authors. I think she had quite a lot of hype recently on BookTube because of Blood Over Brighthaven, which is another fantastic standalone fantasy. Blood Over Brighthaven has quite a different vibe to The Sword of Kaigan, just to set expectations. I think Blood Over Brighthaven is a bit more polished than The Sword of Kaigan, but The Sword of Kaigan impacted me so much more emotionally. We're following members of this community who live right at the tip of this empire, and it's a community of warrior families. Their job is to be the first line of defense if this empire is ever invaded. It is really a book about family and community, and I loved Mitsaki, who is a mother within one of these warrior families. So she married into this warrior family. She had a whole life before this happened, and she was a very competent magic user. However, she was forced to put all of that to one side when she became a mother, and her character arc is one of the best character arcs in fantasy, in my opinion. This had so many emotionally impactful moments. I did also love the magic system, which is an elemental magic system. I also liked how the peak and the climax of the story isn't where you would expect it to be, and you also see the aftermath of that. So yeah, it's not a perfect book. I was really affected by this book, and I think if you like reading about older female main characters in books, then would really recommend this. As a warning though, this does have quite a lot of misogyny and sexism as part of the culture of this community, so if that's something that you don't enjoy reading about, then maybe give this one a miss. That does bring us to 2024, and the first book that I have to talk to you about is The Reformatory by Tanana Reeve Dew. This is a combination of a few different genres. I think it's marketed as horror, and it is horrifying. It also has paranormal elements, which usually I'm not a big fan of. However, I can be okay with it if I know up front that the paranormal elements are going to be there. I would actually describe this as historical fiction. It's set in the 1950s in Florida, and it follows 2 siblings, but in particular a young boy who is sent to this reformatory. It's called a school, it's a prison. He's sent there after kicking a white boy in defense of his sister. This is one of the most gut-wrenching and heartbreaking books that I've ever read. I think that Tanana Reeve Dew is such a talented writer. It is very clear what is happening to the boys at this school, but nothing is ever described in really graphic detail. it's described in more of an emotive way. Like the language that is used, I think, really brings the emotions to the forefront, and I really appreciated that. I also thought that the way that the paranormal elements were used in the story, it was okay for me because it wasn't like the book relied on the paranormal elements for convenience. Robbie essentially sees ghosts of boys who have died at this reformatory. There were so many emotional moments, but what I remembered the most about this book was the ending. The ending was so intense, I was not okay. If you look at the size of this book, it's nearly 600 pages, and I was turning the page because I needed to know how things were going to resolve, and it's a book that has stuck with me long term. I think that, yeah, like I said, Tanana Reeve is such a talented writer, and I would love to read more of her books. That does bring us to the final book on this list, and we're ending with a good one because this was my favourite book of last year. It's a book that I cannot stop thinking about. It really affected me on a personal level. It is, of course, The Measure by Nikki Ehrlich. So this is speculative fiction. I would call it just literary fiction, but it has a speculative element because it's following this situation that's unfolding. People worldwide wake up one morning to find outside their front door or just next to them is a box. On this box it says, "This is the measure of your life," and inside the box is a piece of string. Eventually scientists work out these strings tell you how long you're going to live for, and some people decide to open their boxes, some people decide not to, and in some countries it becomes mandatory and you have to report it to the government. I love it when an author takes a concept or an idea and really explores it with a lot of depth and detail, and I feel like Nikki Ehrlich nailed it with this book. I feel like she thought of everything, and it was such a realistic exploration and portrayal of what would probably actually happen if this happened in reality. I do think it's really important to go into this with the right expectations, so I think it's important to know that this isn't really about why these boxes appeared. It's about how society reacts, and you see how the world changes, how individuals deal with the situation, and it really affected me. I think this book hits differently if you've been through a life-changing illness. A lot of the thoughts that the characters were having were thoughts that I had myself like 5 or 6 years ago, so I could really relate to a lot of the characters' thoughts and feelings, and yeah, I thought it was just fantastic. I cried, which I wasn't expecting, just because of how seen I felt, and the audiobook as well was fantastic. It's narrated by Julia Whalen, who's one of my favourite audiobook narrators, so yeah, it's one that I will continue to recommend, but I think it is important to have the right expectations going in. So those are... oh no! So those are the top 10 books that I have read since starting BookTube. Let me know in the comments if you have read any of these and what you thought of them. Maybe don't let me know if you hated them, but let me know if you found any recommendations from this video, and don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Click subscribe if you would like to see more videos from me, but otherwise I will see you next time. Bye!